The first time the United States invaded the Philippines, it was not called an invasion. It was called a benevolent mission by President William McKinley to civilize and uplift the Filipino people from the brutal Spanish oppressors who had held them down for centuries. And when the Filipinos rose up against the American invaders, that was called an unprovoked rebellion. What followed was one of the most brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in history, which left an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 Filipino freedom fighters dead, and hundreds of thousands more dead from violence, famine, and disease. Hello and welcome to this channel. Today we are going to look at the first time the United States invaded the Philippines. Let's talk about it. In the late 1800s, America was becoming a world power. Having just won the Spanish-American War, the U.S. gained possession of several territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. President McKinley wanted to hold on to these territories, not because they had any real value to the United States, but simply because having territories around the world would make America a world power. And so in the Philippines, McKinley set about the task of exploiting the islands and its people. For centuries, the Philippines had been under the control of Spain. The Spanish had ruled over the islands with an iron fist. They had taken many of the riches from the islands and given little back. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, the Filipino people rose up against their Spanish oppressors and helped the Americans drive the Spanish out of the islands. However, once the fighting was done, the Filipinos quickly found out that the Americans were not there to help them. They were there to take over the islands and exploit them for their own benefit. In February 1899, the Filipino and American flags were raised side by side at the town hall in Manila. The Filipino flag was placed above the American flag during the ceremony, and this was seen as a symbol of the Filipino people's desire for independence from both Spain and the United States. But shortly after this ceremony, fighting broke out between the two sides. On February 4, 1899, a small group of Filipino soldiers attacked a detachment of American troops near Manila. This attack is considered to be the start of the Philippine Revolution. In reality, the revolution had been going on for years, but this was the incident that the United States government used to justify its invasion of the Philippines. Once the fighting started, the Filipino revolutionaries were pushed back. The United States had a much stronger military than the Filipinos. The U.S. Army was better trained, better equipped, and had more supplies. Despite being outnumbered, the Filipino soldiers fought bravely. They used guerrilla tactics to harass the Americans, and they were able to avoid being defeated. President McKinley believed that the Filipino people were not capable of governing themselves, and that the United States had a duty to civilize them. He also believed that the Filipinos were not a threat to the United States, and that the fighting could easily be put down. Unfortunately, he was wrong on both counts. The Filipino people were indeed capable of governing themselves, and they had no intention of accepting American rule. The fighting was far more intense than the United States government had anticipated, and what followed was one of the most brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in history. In order to put down the rebellion, the United States employed a scorched earth policy. This meant that they burned villages and killed anyone who was suspected of supporting the rebellion. American soldiers were given free rein to do whatever they wanted, and they committed some terrible atrocities against the Filipino people. The Balangiga incident is one of the war's most notorious events. On December 1899, American soldiers went on a rampage through the town. They burned buildings, killed civilians, and raped women. They also executed several Filipino prisoners of war without charging them with any crime. This event came to be known as the Balangiga Massacre, and it is remembered as one of the worst atrocities committed by the United States military. During the war, an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 Filipino combatant deaths, and hundreds of thousands of Filipino civilians were killed either by U.S. military forces or indirectly through violence, famine, and disease brought on by the war. In the end, the Filipino people were defeated. The United States had too much military might, and the Filipinos were unable to win. The fighting finally ended in 1902 when the United States granted the Philippines limited. Today, the Filipino people are still angry over how they were treated by the United States. Many see the war as a tragic chapter in the history of both the Philippines and the United States. The Philippine War was a brutal conflict that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. It was a stain on the history of both the Philippines and the United States. The United States believed that it was bringing civilization to the Philippines, but instead it only brought death and destruction. The Filipino people have never forgotten what the United States did to them, and many still feel resentment towards the United States today. But it wasn't all bad. The Philippine War did result in one good thing. It created one of the most badass soldiers in history. After the Filipino people were defeated, one of their greatest leaders, General Luna, was assassinated. But before he died, he trained a soldier named Lapu-Lapu, who would go on to become one of the most badass soldiers in history. If you want to learn more about Lapu-Lapu, click here. And if you want to support this channel, click here. Now let's talk about why the US really invaded the Philippines. The official story is that the US invaded the Philippines to help the Filipino people gain independence from Spain. But there was more to the story. The United States had been eyeing the Philippines for some time before the Spanish-American War. The US government saw the Philippines as a potential market for American goods and also as a strategic location from which to control the Pacific. When the Spanish-American War broke out, the US seized the opportunity to take over the Philippines. The US knew that it could easily defeat the Spanish in the Philippines, and that doing so would give it a valuable territory. In addition to the Philippines, the US also took over Guam and Puerto Rico. These territories were seen as property of the US and were exploited for their resources and cheap labor. For example, sugar plantations were set up in Puerto Rico, and the US military built large bases in the Philippines. It should be noted that the United States did not invade the Philippines to simply set up shop and exploit the island. At the time, other European powers such as Britain and Germany were also interested in the Philippines. The US government feared that if it did not take action, another power would seize the territory. This fear was based on the fact that the US had already lost the race to acquire other territories in the Pacific. For example, Britain had acquired control of Hong Kong and Germany had acquired control of Samoa. The US government was determined not to lose the Philippines to another power. This desire to keep the Philippines out of the hands of other European powers was also driven by racism and a belief in American expansion. The US government believed that it was superior to other nations and that it had a duty to spread democracy and capitalism around the world. This belief was used to justify the takeover of the Philippines and the other territories. The US government claimed that it was bringing freedom and prosperity to these territories, but in reality it was simply taking their resources for itself. In addition to the economic and strategic reasons for invading the Philippines, the US government also had some humanitarian motives. The US believed that it had a duty to help the Filipino people escape Spanish rule. The Spanish had ruled over the Philippines for centuries and had not treated the Filipino people well. The US government saw itself as a benevolent power that was coming to help the Filipinos. However, these humanitarian motives were secondary to the other reasons for invading the Philippines. Ultimately, the decision to invade the Philippines was a strategic one that was based on the desire to acquire new markets and resources. The US government used the Spanish-American War as an excuse to take over the territory, but it was really interested in the Philippines for its own benefit. So what did you think? Was the US right to invade the Philippines? How do you think the Filipino people feel about the US today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about the Philippines, check out this video. Thanks for watching.